Imagine nearly every great power in your world collapsing within your own lifetime. Not one empire falling to another, nearly all of them, together, in the span of a few decades. Cities burned to the ground and never rebuilt. Trade networks that had connected an entire region for centuries simply vanishing. Written language disappearing from whole civilizations for generations. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened around 1200 BC in an event historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, and more than a century of research still hasn't produced a single agreed-upon explanation for why it happened. This is Archive of the Ancients, and today we're piecing together the end of the ancient world's first truly interconnected age. Let's establish what we actually know for certain, because the scale of this collapse is almost hard to believe. In the centuries before 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were home to a network of genuinely sophisticated, interconnected civilizations. The Hittite Empire controlled much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Mycenaean Greece was building palace complexes and controlling extensive trade networks across the Aegean. Egypt, under the New Kingdom, was a dominant regional power. The city of Ugarit on the Levantine coast was a thriving hub of international trade. These civilizations wrote to each other, traded with each other, and in some cases intermarried their royal families. Then, over a period historians place in the late 13th to early 12th century BC, essentially within about 50 years, this entire interconnected system came apart. The Hittite Empire collapsed entirely, and its capital, Hattusa, was destroyed. Mycenaean palace centers across Greece were burned and abandoned, and the sophisticated linear B writing system used by their administrations disappeared for centuries. Ugarit was destroyed and never significantly reoccupied. Egypt survived but suffered serious internal instability and permanently lost influence in territory it once controlled. Egyptian records from this era, including the famous Merneptah stele, describe attacks from groups they called Libyans alongside allied peoples with names like the Ekwesh, Sheklesh, Luka, Shardana, and Teresh. Later Egyptian inscriptions under Ramesses III describe repelling waves of what modern historians collectively call the Sea Peoples, a loose coalition of seafaring groups whose exact origins remain debated to this day. So who were the Sea Peoples really? This is one of the most debated parts of the entire collapse. They weren't a single nation or army. Egyptian records describe them as a coalition of multiple distinct groups, and their origins have been proposed as ranging from the Aegean, western Anatolia, Cyprus, and even as far as Sicily and Sardinia. Some archaeologists caution that we shouldn't treat the Sea Peoples as a unified explanation for the whole collapse. When archaeologists excavated one of the only sites on Cyprus with clear destruction evidence from around 1200 BC, a settlement called Ma Paleocastro, the excavators themselves admitted, quote, "We might suggest that they were pirates, adventurers, or remnants of the Sea Peoples, but this is simply another way of saying that we do not know." That kind of honesty matters here because the Sea Peoples theory, while historically dominant, is no longer treated by most historians as a sufficient explanation on its own. So what else has been proposed? Climate change and drought form one of the strongest modern theories. Multiple lines of paleo-environmental evidence, including pollen records and sediment cores, point to a shift toward cooler, more arid, and less stable climate conditions across the 13th to 10th centuries BC.
Researchers Knapp and Manning, reviewing this evidence in 2016, concluded there was clearly some kind of shift toward drier, less stable conditions during this window, but cautioned that it wasn't necessarily one single climate episode, meaning the climate created a stressful context for collapse without being the sole trigger everywhere. Closely tied to this is the famine and Nile disruption theory. Some researchers argue that drought conditions in the Nile Valley contributed both to internal instability in Egypt and to the migrations of the Sea Peoples themselves, who may have been driven from their own homelands by failing harvests and searching for new territory to settle. Under this view, climate stress didn't just weaken existing kingdoms, it actively created the displaced, aggressive migratory groups that then finished off already struggling states. There's also a systems collapse theory associated with anthropologist Joseph Tainter, which argues the underlying vulnerability wasn't climate or invasion at all, it was complexity itself. Late Bronze Age kingdoms had built highly centralized, specialized, and interdependent political and economic systems. Palace administrations controlled trade, taxation, and food distribution in tightly interconnected networks. Tainter's theory suggests that once serious disruption hit any part of this intricate system, whether from war, drought, or trade collapse, the system as a whole was too rigid and too interconnected to adapt, and it broke apart faster and more completely than a simpler society would have. Then there's the military technology theory, which points to a shift away from the specialized, expensive chariot warfare that Bronze Age palace elites depended on toward more mobile infantry using new weapons and tactics, possibly including early iron weaponry, which was more widely producible than bronze, since bronze required imported tin that had to travel through the very trade networks that were collapsing. Some historians argue this shift undermined the military advantage that centralized palace states had relied on for generations, making them more vulnerable to smaller, more mobile raiding groups. There's also more recent and contested research proposing disease as a contributing factor. Some studies have suggested that an early, now extinct strain of bubonic plague, potentially carried by migrating groups from Central Asia, may have worsened the collapse in Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, and the Levant, though this remains one of the newer and less broadly confirmed theories in the field. And volcanic activity has entered the conversation too. Some Egyptologists have tied the Hekla III eruption in Iceland to famine conditions recorded under Pharaoh Ramesses III, though the exact dating and impact of that specific eruption remains debated among specialists. Earthquakes were once a popular explanation too. Some archaeologists in the mid-20th century proposed a wave of destructive quakes across the region. But more recent research has downgraded this theory considerably, suggesting seismic activity likely played a smaller role than previously believed. So what's the current consensus, if there is one? Most historians today describe the late Bronze Age collapse not as a single catastrophe with one cause, but as a genuine systems failure. Climate stress reducing food security, triggering migrations and piracy, disrupting trade networks that palace economies depended on, weakening already rigid and overextended political structures, and, in some regions, compounding with disease or volcanic disruption. Each factor plausibly made the others worse in a feedback loop that ordinary Bronze Age institutions simply weren't built to survive.
What makes this collapse different from, say, the fall of Rome centuries later is the near-total silence that follows it in several regions. Mycenaean Greece entered what historians literally call a dark age, a period of centuries where writing disappears from the archaeological record entirely. We don't have first-person accounts explaining what happened, because in many places, the very systems that produced written records were among the first things destroyed. That silence is exactly why this remains one of history's most genuinely unresolved mysteries. We have the archaeological evidence of destruction. We have fragments of contemporary accounts from the civilizations that survived, like Egypt. But we don't have a full, coherent explanation agreed upon by the people who actually lived through it, because in many places, there was no one left with the ability to write it down. So here's the question we'll leave you with. Was the late Bronze Age collapse triggered by climate, migration, internal fragility, or some tangled combination that fed on itself until an entire interconnected world came apart at once? We've laid out the leading theories. Now we want to hear which one you find most convincing. Drop your theory in the comments below. If you enjoyed uncovering one of history's largest and least known collapses, subscribe to Archive of the Ancients. New episodes every week.